Here I'd like to introduce a perhaps unorthodox source for the Napoleon Case Study, focusing on the influence on France and Europe debate, but I'll also map this into the extent of Napoleonic reform debate. And that is the current British politician Boris Johnson, who has said some interesting things about the European Union in the last 12 months, actually over the course of his career, but certainly in the last 12 months. What we're going to try to do is actually place Boris Johnson in the context of some of these issues that the syllabus asks us to consider. And that is trying to develop some of the detailed understanding of the different sources that we're working with. It's probably going to be a little bit more brief than others, but we can still work with it in a similar fashion. So what I've done is I've looked at the contribution of Emmanuel de las Casas, I've looked at the contribution of Jules Barney, and I've looked at the contribution of Bonnie Smith, and now another very different commentator on all of this, Boris Johnson. So I'm trying to develop a kind of breadth of understanding of how Napoleon has continually been written about over these years, and what might actually go into shaping the way that this is actually kind of his memory has actually been argued about. And what we're trying to do essentially is pick off some relevant and perhaps somewhat representative interpretations that demonstrate very different ways of approaching the issue of Napoleon. And so this is where Boris Johnson really comes in the latter part of the historiography here. So we're going to try to drill down into this, get some depth out of who he is, what he was actually arguing, and how he came to those conclusions, and think about what that suggests about the debate. So who is Boris Johnson? His biographical details. He's a British Tory Conservative politician, so he's been at this for quite a while, but he has an interesting background, and that is that he studied classics at Oxford University, so he's not uneducated by any means. In fact, he's written several books that we'll have a look at in a minute, and he claims to be a kind of, in a sense, not a complete amateur in this regard, but he, as far as I'm aware, he doesn't have a PhD or anything like that, but he has actually got a grounding in historical and classical studies. So he claims to kind of be an enthusiast of these things even now in his career. After he graduated, he worked mainly as a journalist, and also it's important to note that he worked often for right-wing and conservative papers and magazines like The Spectator. Okay, part of what he did in these roles is that he began to certainly promote ideas of Euroscepticism, which is basically a standpoint that is critical of the idea of trying to integrate Europe in some kind of overarching manner with a system such as the European Union or anything else. It's presenting arguments that suggest that will be difficult, unhelpful, and there are better ways of going about the region relating to itself. So he's arguing from Britain a kind of he's challenging anyway this idea that Europe could somehow be integrated to any real helpful extent. And so this has been a long-standing idea of his. He was elected Mayor of London, and probably where he became most well-known. So from 2008 to 2015, he was the Mayor of London, instituting many interesting reforms, and also obviously being the Mayor of London during the Olympic Games when they had them in 2012. So he came to notoriety through a range of different things. He then re-entered national politics in 2015 and became a very outspoken Brexit campaigner in 2016, which we'll look at in a second. So he has been a very active politician, a very public figure. He has also written several books. So he has written The Churchill Factor, How One Man Made History. So this is all about obviously Winston Churchill and his role in 20th century history. And also an interesting book, perhaps a bit relevant, very directly relevant to what we're talking about here. That's this book, The Dream of Rome. And in The Dream of Rome, Boris Johnson basically argues that the idea of European integration, which was dreamt up by the Romans, and they attempted to kind of, in a sense, bring about this integration, it failed. And he suggests that there's some flaw in the basic idea of European integration, and that is people don't actually value the idea of Europeanness. They value their national heritage or some other kind of heritage. So he has argued publicly and in this context a very fundamental kind of, and to some degree intellectual challenge to the idea of European integration. This was also a documentary series that was presented on the BBC. So it's a fairly public argument that he's made about these sorts of issues. Another thing that's interesting is that he has said a range of interesting things, and one of them, in an interview, it was in the Sydney Morning Herald, that he said there's a very strict view that some people should write and some people should do politics. I think people should do all sorts of things. So he comes from an interesting perspective where he's not pigeonholing people in their role. He thinks it's okay for him to go out and actually argue about politics, about history, about whatever it is that he wants to argue about. And he's pretty aware that that's going to be very contestable, that not everyone will agree on that. But I think this underpins some of his boldness, perhaps, in actually weighing in on historical debates when he's not actually really a professional historian. And that's going to raise some big questions, I think, for us in a minute about things like the authority of historians and so on. What I'm going to focus on here in terms of drawing out some of his ideas of Napoleon is an interview he did with the British newspaper The Telegraph I think this was March 2016. And what I think is interesting about this article is that it draws out some of his arguments about the EU, but along the way he makes interesting references to Hitler and also to Napoleon. So what is he actually, let's quickly unpack the context of this before we really look into the arguments of it. One is that I think we've got to see this in the context of the growing fragmentation or democratization of history. I'm referencing here Daniel Wolfe. Okay, his Global History of History in 2011 argued this idea that really at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, we're really seeing an opening up of voices in history. More people commenting on history, more people being written about by historians. So it's opening up in all sorts of different ways, and this is a good example of that. It's not that politicians haven't made public statements about history before, but that this is just part of what we see as normal now. It's almost impossible to turn around and accuse someone like Boris Johnson of not being a historian, therefore they're not valid. And that's sort of reflective of this idea that people don't see historians necessarily as this unassailable class. Also, I think it's part of this general idea of a crisis, you might say, of historical authority, revolving around the question who owns the past. Do historians and should historians play the dominant role, or are other people actually allowed to participate in this in an equal manner? And Boris Johnson, I think, certainly thinks so. I also think this is important, and that is this trend that many people are talking about now of post-truth politics. What we're essentially talking about, it's a very complicated sort of thing, but what we're essentially talking about is public debates and public political debates that are ruled and basically run by emotion and kind of emotive ideas rather than detailed and rigorous analysis of issues, okay, or ideas. So what that's suggesting is that politicians are often, not always, but often nervous about really engaging in policy debates, and what they're more interested in is sound bites and talking points and much more simplistic ideas that resonate with particular portions of the population. And perhaps you could argue that this is actually where some of Boris Johnson's claims about Napoleon actually come from. Just quick sound bites that are meant to actually do something political, but also do something to our understanding potentially of history. And it's also very important to see these comments that he makes as coming up in the immediate context of the Brexit campaign of June 2016, when they had a referendum in the UK on whether to leave the European Union. And important to note that the Leave vote actually won this, so they gained 51% of the vote, and therefore it has been and still is a highly contentious issue. The last time I weighed in on this and tried to read some analysis of it, it seems that the actual leaving of the European won't take place until 2019, which means there's lots of contention and debate about how this is going to work and why it happened and all this sort of stuff. But the marginal victory is suggesting some kind of division, okay? It's not an overwhelming majority at all. Now, Boris Johnson was obviously on the Leave side of this argument. He's a Eurosceptic. He's arguing that Britain should have left, so they did the right thing in his view. What are the aims and purposes in Boris Johnson's comments about Napoleon? Well, this is, again, I'm not trying to suggesting that we see Boris Johnson as an equal to someone like, Adolphe Thiers or, Bonnie Smith, or someone who has written more rigorously about that. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. But I'm suggesting that we have to actually treat these as serious historical comments because some other people do. And this is part of the problem that historians now have. Someone like Boris Johnson has a much bigger audience than historians. So he gets to perhaps shape the debate a little more than historians. So his purposes are overtly political. He was an open campaigner for the Leave vote. So he was trying to a large degree in his references to Napoleon to, I think, undermine this idea of the European Union. So he was attacking the legitimacy of the Union and also its use, whether it was very useful for the British people, whether it was desirable even generally in Europe. And on the back of his book, The Dream of Europe, it's pretty obvious that he'd be arguing no. And he's using references to people like Napoleon and Hitler and so on as a way of trying to quickly and in a very sort of easy to access kind of fashion link the European Union with very obviously negative issues like Hitler. Okay, and also by throwing Napoleon in there, he's kind of commenting on the debate about whether Napoleon actually had some sort of positive or negative impact on Europe. So these are sound bites, but they're important sound bites because they are weighing in on the debate to some degree, and they perhaps are shaping and helping shape or reaffirming how people actually see Napoleon as a historical figure. So what does he say? In terms of this, we're not really looking at how he constructed history because the claims don't really come off the back of anything obvious in terms of like historical analysis, but he does weigh in on this debate and he does say some very specific things about it. I think partly this is based in the background. I'm going to give him this, and that is that his book, The Dream of Rome, is sitting in the background, which was an open argument against the idea of the European Union. Basically suggesting that all attempts to unify Europe had failed to bring the continent together. And the same argument he's really applying here to Napoleon and to the EU. So his claims aren't developed out of, I'm not suggesting this book does discuss Napoleon briefly, but not really in much detail. What I'm suggesting here is this is not like Bonnie Smith, who kind of analyzes some documents and comes to a very specific conclusion. He basically applies his already the conclusions he's already developed. He applies them to Napoleon in this case. So this is not objectivity or analysis or rigor. This is opportunism and populism, I think, underwriting how he's actually developed these comments. So I think that's part of the important point, is that we don't see this. I'm not suggesting you see this as the approach to history or the method in any way similar to someone like Bonnie Smith. So what does he actually say? Well, his big point was that in the last 2,000 years of European history, there's been repeated attempts to unify Europe under a single structure, government, or leader. So this is partly how he sees European history, an attempt to integrate, and he says, Napoleon, Hitler, various people have tried this out, and it always ends tragically. The EU is an attempt to do this, i.e. create a unified Europe, but by different methods. So he's not suggesting that the EU is exactly the same as Hitler, as in it's some sort of murderous regime. He's not necessarily saying Napoleon is exactly the same as Hitler either, but he is saying they all share a similar quality, and that is that they tried to unify Europe, but it was completely flawed. Okay, so what we can start to think of is the way this implicates Napoleon in a flawed project, and therefore in a kind of a tragic project. So one that was ultimately not necessarily positive. So Boris Johnson, although he hasn't expounded what he means by this, he has put Napoleon in a general project that has been generally negative for Europe as a whole. Interestingly as well, he points out, and he goes on in the interview, this was with the Telegraph in May 2016, that most often the means to unify Europe have been violent, and I think here he is talking about the Napoleonic Wars and also Hitler's attempt to conquer Europe, but and this is his distinction, is that the European Union is essentially a kind of bureaucratic imperialism, not a violent imperialism. Okay, so he's not being completely silly in the way he's arguing this by saying Napoleon and Hitler and the EU are exactly the same, but there's a similarity between them he's suggesting. It's interesting to note as well that he was actually defended by many of his colleagues. He was attacked very rigorously for linking the EU and Hitler in any way. Very emotive issue, obviously, in Europe, and he's done this intentionally. His Tory colleagues, or some of them at least, because they're a divided party as well, but some of his Tory colleagues, like this guy Ian Duncan Smith, came out and actually defended him. Ian Duncan Smith said something pretty interesting as well. It is a historical fact, Okay, so here you've got a guy weighing in again on this debate, being a kind of amateur historian. It is a historical fact of life that you go through Napoleon, Hitler, everyone else. I think the whole process of trying to drive Europe together by force or by bureaucracy ultimately makes problems. So here he's picking up on the narrative of Boris Johnson and suggesting the same thing, that it causes problems, negative issues for Europe, and hence they're implicating Napoleon in a fairly negative kind of event. So this is a quote that came out of the Guardian newspaper following this story. So there's a few problems here. In terms of evaluating it, well, it's a good piece of evidence, I think, this source, to show that historians don't actually own the past. And what I mean by that is that there are many voices that play an important role in shaping our society's memory of these old events and these people of past times. Historians are one voice, absolutely, but some people may never read a book about Napoleon, and they may shape their views from entirely public sources and popular sources. Boris Johnson may have a greater influence on many people's understanding of Napoleon than many historians do. So this is part of the reason many people see history in a kind of state of crisis, because historians are losing ground to some degree in parts of society, and people like Boris Johnson have a far greater role in this. So that's an interesting part of this, I think, this source. It's also important to point out, I think, here that, as Bernardino Grocchi, the Italian philosopher, said, all history is contemporary history. What he means by this is you can always find contemporary concerns in any historical analysis. I mean, this is quite obvious here that Boris Johnson is being incredibly opportunist for his campaign for Brexit, and that's actually coming through clearly in the way he's dealt with his comments on Napoleon. I wonder if you could actually see this as kind of popular history at its worst. I'm not suggesting all popular history is like this at all. I'm not even suggesting perhaps Boris Johnson's book, The Dream of Rome, is as simplistic as this. But his comments here are interesting in that perhaps this reflects how bad history can be when it's basically devoid of any method, devoid of any real scrutiny, devoid of any real self-reflection, and not really interrogating the facts of Napoleonic rule, but just suggesting things that suit your political purposes. And I'm not suggesting that this is absolutely, common amongst politicians or anything like that, but I am suggesting it's also not uncommon. Okay, so this is part of the problem, and I think the main point that I want to make is this idea about historical authority. Okay, how does it fit the debates if you're being asked to discuss things in the case study? Well, in terms of the impact on France and Europe, it's obviously part of the tradition that sees Napoleon as basically negative. So Peter Geil actually wrote some things linking Napoleon to Hitler as well, very carefully, very cautiously, and on the back of some very robust historical analysis. But basically, Boris Johnson is picking up on this and simplifying it for a very populist reason. It's suggesting that basically Napoleon's legacy was one of empire and failure, rather than any kind of noble concern or any sense of real benevolence at the bottom of this. This is Napoleon's attempt to really unify Europe under his rule as a dictator, essentially, and it failed because it failed to really understand what Europe is. So that's his suggestion, is that the impact was almost in its largest sense. There might have been pockets of positive influence and impact, but generally speaking, Napoleon was part of a fairly negative tradition. In terms of the Napoleonic reform debate, I think it's possible to bring that up here as well, because I think, or at least what I think Boris Johnson is trying to argue, is that the guiding principle of Napoleon was not necessarily freedom. Okay, what he was actually trying to, is this idea that he was trying to bring about the freedom of the European people and, democracy for everyone, or some kind of liberation from other empires like Russia and Britain and so on. I think actually Boris Johnson is saying really Napoleonic reforms were essentially designed to facilitate control. So they were actually, in a sense, geared in that direction. So there's a deep cynicism about Napoleonic reform and the general Napoleonic agenda, I would argue, coming from Boris Johnson. So this is a very different kind of source. I'm not suggesting that you would have to put this into an essay, but it could be an interesting source to use if you were, say, asked to write and think about the role of public history, or what historians bring in terms of their political ideology to these debates about Napoleon.